Hello, this is Domenico again with NOMICS, and this will be part two of a look at per unit tariffs. We saw tariffs in terms of its impact on an importing nation, but now we'll look at its impact on an exporting nation. The previous example that was used in the initial tariff video was looking at Trump's tariffs, the imposition of tariffs on steel, U.S. imported steel being taxed 25%. Aluminum 10%. This was back in March of 2018. And it was targeted towards China, which led to a trade war. And of course, China retaliated with their own tariffs against the United States. And for most economists, the moral of the story is trade wars just simply don't work. Once one nation imposes tariffs, then the nation receiving the tariffs will just retaliate with their own tariffs, and then both sides are worse off, essentially, in most cases, I would say. Exports, let's look at exports of steel in 2017. We can see China was the #1 net exporting nation, but you can see clearly that China is the biggest net steel exporter, 60.9 million metric tons. And again, in 2019, we see the ranking of countries by production. 2019, China again ranked #1, #2, India, Japan, the United States. But then when we take into consideration exports minus imports, we get this ranking. China #1 in terms of exports, and then in terms of imports, #1 net imports, the United States. So you can see that there's a pretty strong link between the US and Chinese economy. US being a big buyer of steel, one of their biggest sellers being China. And so we saw in the previous video the impact of the United States imposing a tariff to reduce imports of steel into their domestic economy. But let's see what that impact would be on China. And again, even though we're using China as the exporting nation, when China would then impose their tariffs against the United States, it would be the same situation for both countries, the other way around. Okay, so this is our start off point. And here we have the price of steel. We're looking at the market for steel. This is graph B to tie it into graph A, the first video on tariffs. We're looking at this domestic steel market in China, right? Just keep focused that we're looking at China, and China is the exporting nation. Why? Well, here we have price measured on the y-axis, quantity measured on the x-axis. We have our upward sloping supply of steel in the domestic economy, SD1, supplying the domestic economy. In accordance to law of supply, we have our downward sloping demand for steel in the domestic economy, demand in the domestic, DD1, and the intersection of SD1, right, where SD1 equals DD1, it sets the domestic equilibrium price. And the domestic equilibrium price is at PD, which we see here, and the domestic equilibrium quantity is set at QD, right? And then we compare the domestic price to the world price. And we can see that the world price of world, is greater than the domestic price. That means that China's costs of production, the land, labor, capital resources that are used to produce steel, are lower than other nations. And with other nations in the global industry setting the price for steel, China has a comparative advantage. Their opportunity cost or their cost of production are lower than other countries, and so they will export. So since, again, world price is less than domestic price, China will engage in world trade and export, and they will increase the quantity supplied along their domestic supply curve up to the world price, up to a quantity of Q4 that we see here. And because they will price higher also within their domestic economy, the quantity demanded by Chinese, let's say, firms are demanding steel as a key input, that quantity demand will decrease to Q1. And essentially, the exports will run from Q4 to Q1. All right, so we're going to mark this. as exports before the impact of the tariff, all right? Exports before the tariff by the US imposed on China for steel, okay? So that's a significant quantity that's being exported by China in this particular model. So let's go ahead and get rid of this. We don't need this for now, just to illustrate why China is exporting, because their domestic price is lower than the world price. So they have the comparative advantage, their cost of production being lower than that of other nations, like perhaps the United States, and so they will export. We have China engaging in global trade. Um, there is no tariff imposed, and at the world price, at PW, China will export. Right? China will export a quantity of Q4 minus Q1 going into the world market. And then Chinese consumption will run from 0 to Q1. Okay? All right. Now, in terms of producer surplus, we can see the extent of that producer surplus. China following their cost of production up to the world price. And so this triangular area represents the producer surplus for the exporting nation, kind of their profit margin. And we can also see the level of consumer surplus in the Chinese economy being right here. Okay, small consumer surplus. Right? And at this point, all right, at Q4, and I've illustrated this in a previous video, we can say that this is globally allocatively efficient, that the marginal cost, the global marginal cost, is equal to the marginal benefit. SD1 equal to the marginal cost of production for the exporting nation. And then for the importing nation, this could be the United States, just to illustrate, the US's demand curve perhaps coming out to here. This would be demand by the foreign nation, DF, let's say, right? And that would be their marginal benefit. So where marginal benefit equals marginal cost, at that intersection, we've reached allocative efficiency, okay? Just to illustrate that point. So the United States imposes that tariff, that per unit tariff. So we know that with tariffs, tariffs are a tax on imports. And we know from a microeconomic perspective that taxes reduce the price received by the producer. So taxes reduce the price received by the producer. Okay, and we know that taxes increase the price paid by consumers. In this case, the US consumer will have to pay more. So if a per unit tax is imposed on China, that would have the effect of reducing the price received for the exporting producer. Okay? So that would be the demand curve, or I'm sorry, the world price curve, which is the world supply curve, falling by the amount of the tax. Right? So that would be, perhaps let's say it falls to this point. So we have PW, and that's PW minus the tariff, because the price received by the producer is the world price minus the tariff, the tax that they have to pay. And we can state that this is the world price minus the tariff, which is also equal to the world supply curve minus the tariff. Okay? So that is equal to the world supply curve minus the tariff. All right? So what happens to the quantity supplied, right? The quantity supplied, because the price received by the producer that is exporting steel, it will decrease along their supply curve. So the quantity supplied decreases, to this point, from Q4 to Q3. Okay? And the domestic quantity demanded will increase from Q1 to this point, Q2. So there'll be more domestic consumption of steel in China. Okay, so we can go ahead and also label some points if that can help us with our analysis. We say that this is point A, right, and the quantity supplied has been reduced from point A to point B, or from Q4 to Q3. And then we could say that the quantity demanded within this domestic economy has increased from point C to point D along the domestic demand curve, or from Q1 to Q2. Thus, the exports have been reduced, running from Q3 to Q2. Okay, so this is exports after tariff. All right. Now, we can also illustrate the welfare law. So let's go ahead and draw that. So that would just be a straight line up here and a straight line up here. And now we can label some areas to help us with our evaluation or the impact on stakeholders. Okay, so here is area A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, and J. Okay, and now let's go ahead and evaluate. Right? Maybe perhaps I'll give you a quick analysis. And again, all these notes will be in the information section of the video, and then we'll get into the evaluation. So as can be seen, we have a graph B, illustrating the national or domestic market for steel in China, China as an exporting nation. We have price measured on the x-axis, quantity measured on the y-axis. We have an upward sloping supply in the domestic economy, according to the law of supply, labeled SD1, which is equal to our global marginal costs of production. And we have our downward sloping demand curve in the domestic economy labeled DD1. Since China has a domestic price set below the world price, they will export, since they have the comparative advantage or the lower cost of production compared to other nations, perhaps like the United States. And so they will increase their quantity supplied to Q4 and price at world price. And as a result of that higher price, the quantity demanded within the Chinese economy will be reduced to Q1. Thus, an amount of Q4 minus Q1 will be exported into the global market and perhaps exported to the United States. All right. Then the United States imposes a tariff, 25% tariff on steel, and that reduces the price received by Chinese domestic steel producers from PW to PW minus tariff, reducing the world price in China to world price minus tariff, which is equal to the world supply curve minus tariff. And as a result of that lower price received, the quantity supplied by Chinese domestic firms decreases along their supply curve from point A to point B, or from Q4 to Q3. And the domestic quantity demanded as a result of that lower price increases from point C to D along the demand curve, domestic demand curve, or from Q1 to Q2. That leads to reduced exports by China of an amount of Q3 minus Q2. Okay, so that would be your analysis, your explanation of the model. And let's go ahead and analyze. So let's first take a look at Chinese producers, or the exporting nation as a producer. So number one, right, producers, right, as an exporting, producing firms. All right, they are worse off with the tariff. Why? Because the price received falls from PW to PW minus tariff. And that reduces the producer surplus. All right, the producer surplus before the tariff was equal to areas B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J. All right, so it's equal to B plus C plus D plus E plus F plus G plus H plus I plus J. Okay, but then producer surplus, all right, let's make a note here, producer surplus after the tariff has been reduced. It's now equal to G, H, I, and J. G plus H plus I plus J. So what does that look like? All right, so originally, the producer surplus was this triangular area. This was kind of the level of profit margin that these Chinese manufacturers had. All right, but then it is reduced because of the lower price received to this area. Okay, all right, great. And we can also discuss total revenue. Total revenue before, and then total revenue after. So total revenue one, was the amount of revenue being gained by the firm before the tariff, which was PW, price at world, multiplied by Q4. All right, this large rectangular area here. And then total revenue 2, which is the total revenue gained after the tariff, is PW minus the tariff multiplied by a lower quantity of Q3. Thus, total revenue 1, or total revenue before the tariff, is greater than total revenue after the tariff. So clearly, again, we have another reason to explain why the Chinese firms are worse off with the tariff. All right, so total revenue was PW times Q4, this rectangular area, and then it has been reduced to this rectangular area. Okay, so producers clearly worse off. Let's look at Chinese consumers. Number 2, all right, we're looking at consumers within this domestic economy, consumers in the domestic economy of China, and they are better off, right? Because the price has fallen. Price falls for the Chinese consumers of steel from PW to PW minus the tariff. All right, and that allows their quantity demand to increase from Q1 to Q2. So quantity demand increases from Q1 to Q2, and that increases their consumer surplus. We can just make a note that the consumer surplus before the tariff was equal to area A, and then the consumer surplus after the tariff has increased to areas A plus B plus C. So we can highlight that. Originally, it was this rectangular area before the tariff, and now it has increased because of the lower price, more kind of savings for those that are demanding steel to areas A, B, and C. So consumers benefit from that tariff. Now let's take a look at, let's say, for example, number 3, we can look at the domestic government. All right, the domestic government, this being the government of China, they're worse off, right? Why? Because since total revenue for the Chinese exporting firms is falling, these firms that are producing less and selling less will provide, let's say, less corporate tax. So less corporate tax being paid by these steel producers, and so the domestic government of China will receive less tax revenue from these Chinese producing steel firms. In addition, we can also look at number 4, the domestic workers within the steel industry. Sorry, domestic workers within the Chinese steel industry will be worse off because since the quantity supplied is going to decrease from Q4 to Q3, since Chinese firms will decrease their quantity supplied, they will begin to fire excess resources like labor. So labor will be fired. All right, the excess resources will be fired. And so workers are worse off. Increased unemployment in the steel industry. And that would mean that the domestic government is worse off because they will have to provide more unemployment benefits. So the amount of unemployment benefits that they'll have to pay will go up. Right? A greater expense for the Chinese government. They're getting less corporate taxes from the steel producers since they're producing less. And since there's more unemployment in the steel industry, the Chinese government will have to provide more unemployment benefits. So that's a negative for both the domestic worker and the domestic government. Okay. Now we can also mention how does this impact foreign nation like the United States, and we've already seen that in the other video. So just to quickly recap, all right, number one, for the foreign consumers in the foreign nation, this being the US, they're going to be worse off because the price of steel is going to go up in their own country. So when we looked at the United States imposing a tariff, we saw that the price went up from PW to PW plus tariff, right? And that would lead to less consumption by them. And in terms of the producers in the foreign nation, this being the US foreign steel producers, they will benefit, right? Since the price will go up on their side and they can increase the production in their own nation, and that would create jobs within the steel industry with the United States. We already covered that, but you can mention that perhaps briefly in your evaluation. Now let's talk about welfare loss, right? Since there's a decrease in the quantity supplied, and now that firms are producing here, we can say that at Q3, right, we're going to talk about welfare loss. We could say that at Q3, the marginal benefit by the United States demand curve is going to be greater than the marginal cost of production on the Chinese supply curve. So remember, I had that demand curve coming down here. I'll just illustrate that once again so we can see that idea. Here's the US demand curve. And remember that demand curve equals the marginal benefit. So if we were to draw a line from Q3 straight up, this would be the marginal benefit here being greater than the marginal cost at point B. All right, hopefully you can understand that here is marginal benefit for the US demand curve being greater than the supply or the marginal cost of production here. So here's that welfare loss. Here's the triangle that we'd see in the global market for steel. So we can highlight that at Q3, the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost, which means that there's an under allocation of resources to the production and consumption of steel. Thus, it is globally allocatively inefficient. Right? Chinese firms should be producing more, but they're not. And we have inefficient US firms producing more, and they shouldn't be. So area F is a welfare loss due to the lost production by an efficient steel producing firm. In addition, we have another welfare loss of area D. All right, area D is a welfare loss because we have increased consumption by Chinese consumers when in fact they should not be consuming this steel. This steel should be exported and consumed by US consumers. And we also have an additional welfare loss of area E. Okay. Area E is the tariff revenue that is gained by the United States. So Chinese firms will have to pay that tax, and that tax will only benefit the US economy. It will go to the US government and benefit their stakeholders, but it will not benefit the Chinese stakeholders. So in addition, area F would also be a welfare loss to the Chinese exporting nation. Okay, so that is an analysis and evaluation of this model. Again, in the information section of this video, I'll provide outlines of the analysis and evaluation. And that is it. If you have any questions, feel free to comment, and don't forget to subscribe and to like. Thank you so much.